Help me welcome to the front Dr. Lapan.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Let's make sure technology is our friend today. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today. Again, I'm Candace Lapan. I go by Candy. Feel free to call me that. And not that probably anybody but myself really cares, but I did update my title on my slides because I am now an associate professor of psychology at Wingate. I just got my tenure and promotion email last week. So very exciting. But thank you so much for having me today. When I got the email with the invitation to come speak on this topic, I was honestly just excited that anybody had read anything that I have ever written. So to hear that somebody did read the article that I had written for the Psychonomic Society, and that resonated and was something that people wanted to hear more about. This is the most exciting conference presentation that I have gotten to give because it's on something I'm super passionate about. So I hope that it's helpful to be here today, and I'm excited to share with you. Unlike most talks that I give, I am a developmental psychologist, so most of the time I'm talking about the development of stereotyping and prejudice in preschoolers or social comparison in preschoolers. This is a very different type of talk. I want to share a little bit about my lived experience in the world of higher education as somebody who identifies as a member of the LGBTQ community. I am a scientist, so I will share with you some research as well as my lived experience on what that experience is like for a lot of folks who exist in the realm of higher education, whether that's as a student or as a faculty member. Then I will talk about this idea, which was really what prompted me to write the article that has been mentioned, was about existing within these higher education communities that are then embedded within other broader communities, and what that is like and what we should be considering, especially as people that work within higher education and trying to make this a better experience for students, for faculty and staff. I will also talk a bit about your town. I think that that is a good segue into thinking about how these things might be applicable. And very interestingly to me, it felt like I knew your town when I read about it. And I'll talk about that a bit more and just how it relates to my own personal experience in the place in which I live. And then I will end with some recommendations that hopefully are helpful for you all and broadly for people within higher education, and obviously open it up for what I hope is some great discussion about these topics. I will start my talk with just a disclaimer about my own positionality and identity. I identify as a bisexual, cisgender, feminine presenting white woman. And that perspective is very limited. So I do not intend for my words or even the research that I discuss to represent all queer people and all intersectional identities. That is certainly not the case. I'm going to present a very particular perspective of my own life and my own life narrative. And then I will talk about research and the many limitations of the research that we have on the experience of LGBTQ people, particularly for the experience of LGBTQ people of color and transgender women of color. So these people have experienced much worse than what I'm going to talk about today in this very brief moment. And so just to recognize that and note that this is not the experience for everybody. Everybody's experience may be different, and might be doubly have experienced double harm than what I described today. So just to keep those things in mind. And again, that even the research that we discuss in the field of psychology, we know most of our research is very limited to very biased samples and is not historically representative of all LGBTQ people. So again, I'm going to start off and just tell you a little bit about myself. This is the very non-scientific part of the talk. Where I'm going to just tell you a bit about my own lived experience that I hope that somebody else finds helpful besides Dr. Langston when reading that article. So I am a first generation college student, and I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so when I first entered into the realm of higher education, I really knew nothing about that experience at all. I literally applied to one school because I just thought you were just supposed to apply to the one school that you wanted to go to. And so I applied to UNC Greensboro, and thankfully I got into UNC Greensboro because that was the only place that I submitted an application. I didn't have mentorship. I certainly didn't have queer mentorship. I sort of fell into whatever was close by and familiar to me, which was UNC Greensboro. It's about 2 hours away from Charlotte. Um, this is a university that is probably somewhat similar to where you all are. It's a very large university, close to about 20,000 students. It's a public university, a very diverse student body, and was a very inclusive space for me attending there. It honestly was something where I didn't even really have to question or think about whether my identities were welcome at the place that I was attending. And I don't think I engaged in a lot of active reflection at all about my identity, particularly my sexual identity, in the years that I spent there, which were a lot, by the way, because I went there all the way from my undergrad through my PhD. So I spent 11 years at UNCG getting all of my degrees. And that idea of your university being situated within a broader community, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, which probably means nothing to you. But if you know anything about North Carolina, Greensboro is probably one of the most gay-friendly towns you could possibly live in. We have tons of queer community. We have lots of queer spaces. We have a wonderful pride. We have just lots of nonprofit organizations. It's a very, very inclusive space. So it was somewhere, again, where like I didn't even feel like I had to think or question a lot about my identity. It was just something that was easy and something that didn't make me reflect a whole lot at that point in my life. As I started to reach the end of my thankfully 11-year academic journey, I was very glad to be through with that. But then is when I had to start really thinking a lot more because I was going to then venture out of this place that I had found comfort and safety and felt really welcome. And then suddenly one day I was like, I have to think about going somewhere different where maybe that is not the case. And it was actually my graduate advisor at the time who prompted me to think about that and was like, where are you applying for jobs like after you leave here? And are you going to talk about your identity? Is it something you are considering? Are you thinking about that? And I've had this whole like epiphany that suddenly I needed to think about these things. Suddenly I would be going into different spaces where perhaps I wasn't welcome. And I needed to navigate that in some way. And it was a very scary thing. Um, it made my eyes open to what this experience looks like for people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So first, it was just weighing that idea of self-disclosure. If you've ever been through the process of applying for academic jobs, it's horrific and time-consuming. And you write all of these personal narratives and research statements and cover letters that you really are trying to sell yourself as an academic. And a real key decision for people either applying, this applies also for people applying to graduate school. In my case, that wasn't really something that I was thinking about at the time, but a lot of my students that go on to graduate programs that I advise now, this is when they start thinking about that. Do I self-identify in some way on my application materials? And suddenly I was faced with this decision to do that or not to do that, because it's a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, if you self-identify, perhaps you are shooting yourself in the foot and you're going to lose opportunities because people will discriminate against you. On the other hand, would you want to be in those spaces anyway? Right. And so for me personally, at the end in that decision, I did self-identify because for me, it was I didn't want to end up in a place or in a situation where I was unwelcome. And I hoped that by self-identifying, one, it would eliminate that. And two, it would also speak to my knowledge and expertise in working with LGBTQ students and the other benefits of knowledge and experience that I could bring to an institution in which I worked. Just disclaimer, that wasn't always effective. I did still end up in spaces and uncomfortable positions where I was being interviewed by people who were not welcoming to people from an LGBTQ community, despite the fact that I had self-identified in my materials. When you're applying for jobs, you look for indicators of whether or not the place that you're applying is going to be a welcoming space. And what I encountered in that journey was a lot of vague equal opportunity employment statements that lots of places employ. And while I certainly appreciate that lots of people did indeed fight to get those vague equal opportunity statements included in many higher education institutions, they still were not really an indicator of whether or not the place that you were going to work was very welcoming and supportive. And I think there's a continuing theme throughout my experience of places that were tolerant as opposed to places that celebrated the queer community. And those places in which they were tolerant were often very uncomfortable and not really friendly spaces. When I went to interview for jobs, I will spare you the details, but feel free to talk to me anytime. There were many times in which I was approached with inappropriate or uncomfortable questions about my identity, despite the fact that I self-identified on my applications. Terms like your alternative lifestyle came up in my job interviews in higher education. Um, just very uncomfortable situations, despite the fact that I self-identified at all. And so you can imagine the traumatic experiences again and again of going to these places where you don't know anybody, and being interviewed and having people judge you for your fitness and working at their institution while similarly experiencing homophobia. There were also places in which I interviewed where perhaps they were not so openly homophobic, but instead they just didn't know how to have a conversation about queerness at all. Um, and that was just not a place for me, right? We have to be able to have those conversations. It's part of who I am, and it's part of some of the work that I do, and it's part of my goal to mentor students. And when I would bring questions or start a discussion, they just couldn't talk about those things at all. And that was really problematic. Um, I am an associate professor now. I work at Wingate University. Prior to working there, I was a visiting professor at Francis Marion University, and I did a postdoctoral position at the University of Virginia. And I put these three universities on a spectrum of how really welcoming and inclusive they were in terms of their programming or perspectives on LGBTQ issues. Francis Marion was a bit of a shock to me. It's a small university in Florence, South Carolina. If you haven't heard of it, that's not surprising. And that was a very culture shock of a year working there. And then I moved and worked at the University of Virginia, which is probably one of the most inclusive spaces you could literally ever be a part of. They have an entire LGBTQ center. They have a queer student union. I could go on for days of all of the things. And then where I work now, I would say is somewhere in between. Wingate University is a small private institution in Wingate, North Carolina, which is about 30 minutes outside of Charlotte. It is traditionally associated with the Southern Baptist Church, although they broke ties about 10 or so years ago, formally with the Southern Baptist Church. It still is a university that has Baptist roots in terms of the people that work there and the ethos of the campus. When I talk to people about why I work at Wingate University or why I chose to work there, why I landed there, I try to talk about this spectrum of welcomeness towards the LGBTQ community in my experience. And I said, well, when I was at Francis Marion, it seemed impossible to exist there. It was just so unwelcoming. There was so little, and there was just so much pushback towards any type of progress. It was exhausting. But when I worked at UVA, I felt like I wasn't even needed there because there was already so much. Like I didn't feel like there was anything for me to contribute to that institution. And there probably was, but at the same time, that's really sort of how I felt. But when I landed at Wingate, when I interviewed there, when I talked with people, it felt like a space that needed a lot of work, but that was open to change, where I felt like my voice would actually be heard there and would actually make a difference. And I can say now, as an associate professor, having been there for 6 years, I do feel like my voice has made quite a difference in that particular culture. So that's my sort of journey. That's where we are today. I could talk a lot more about some of these things, but I will refrain. Um, in my role now as a faculty member, having finally reached that pinnacle of what we all hope for, right, as getting a tenure track position, I still encountered lots of issues, right, which I sort of expected because, as I've described, Wingate is sort of in that in between. Um, Lots of lack of knowledge around LGBTQ issues on our campus. So I have fallen into that role often of educating others. When I started work there was only one other faculty member in our entire university that I knew that identified as LGBTQ, and he was a white man, so a gay white man. We have experienced a number of bias incidents on campus related to LGBTQ issues, things that I've witnessed myself or things that students have experienced. We have welcomed, in my very first year at my job, welcomed Mike Pence to have a campaign event on our campus in which we closed down and canceled all classes for him to come to our university. We have had protesters on our campus when we hosted LGBTQ events. We have had other faculty members present biased content in their classrooms towards trans people. We have had very stereotypical campus programming. I asked this question about the stereotypes around HIV and AIDS and its association with the LGBTQ community because in our Pride Week, one of our programs was just like an AIDS program. I was like, you can't do that. That's not appropriate. Like, we can talk about the history. We can talk about, the queer community in being activists in this epidemic, but we're not just going to talk about HIV and AIDS as if only the queer community experiences that. And generally, we just had a real lack of policies for LGBTQ faculty members, staff, or students. For example, one of my colleagues, when he first started working at Wingate University, his husband could not be on his health insurance. We didn't have a name change policy. We didn't have any inclusive restrooms. So there's like many different things that we have seen progress on, but these are some of the examples in which higher education institutions are still seemingly failing our LGBTQ students as well as our employees. All of that is within the walls, or what I say, in the halls of higher education. But I also live in Union County, North Carolina. Personally, I live in Monroe, North Carolina. Again, a suburb of Charlotte, so about 20 to 30 minutes outside of Charlotte. And our town and our county has experienced the same things that you see in your town probably and in other towns across the country. In 2022, I sat on the first ever board for Union County Pride. We had never had a pride in our county at all. Of course, again, Charlotte, right down the road, and Mecklenburg County has one of the biggest prides in the entire country. But 30 minutes away, you enter into a very different world. That experience was traumatizing. That experience for me sitting on that board was emotionally disturbing. We were protested, we were targeted, we were called pedophiles, we were called groomers, we had our personal information plastered on the internet. We had groups that threatened us, that made violent threats against us. The list sort of goes on. One of our wonderful downtown businesses in our very small downtown that has been so supportive, that flies a pride flag, that has endorsed Pride, that helped be a sponsor, has done lots of events for us, has hosted drag performances. They have been consistently harassed. Their employees have received death threats. They're now currently being sued by a conservative group in the county. Our schools didn't make headlines, maybe like Florida, but our school system quietly passed "Don't Say Gay" policies, just like Florida and Union County Public Schools. Our libraries took down their pride displays at the behest of our city council, and they have attempted to disallow us from using public spaces for things like pride and drag performances. And that was in response to Pride and other events that we've had recently. Just last week, our mayor, who was elected by a coin flip, I'm not kidding you, because we had an actual tie in our vote for mayor, literally an exact tie. And our policies in our town are that if there is an exact tie, the mayor is to be selected by a coin flip instead of an additional election. I can't make these things up. So he was elected by a coin flip. Last week, he attended an anti-LGBT protest outside of our art center, protesting an artistic drag performance that we held there. This impacts students and faculty and staff. While even at my institution, these smaller things that we deal with, we see progress and change and a culture of commitment to LGBTQ people, I live here. I live in this place. And that is something that I don't think that we are thinking about quite enough. And what prompted me to write about that experience and how living through this impacted my career. It impacted my ability to function in my day-to-day life, to write an article or submit to a conference or put together a lecture for my students. These things are real for queer people. And so we have to start thinking about how we can support them outside of just our university as well. Okay, I'll stop talking about myself now. So what do we know about LGBTQ people's experience within higher education? Our research is really rather limited. And there's one big reason why we don't have a lot of data on queer people, and that's because there are no federal requirements to collect information through federal entities on sexual orientation. There's currently an act trying to be passed, the LGBTQI plus Data Inclusion Act, which has passed the House and is still needs Senate approval to require this. So when we talk about decisions about housing needs, there are so many people who face housing needs, particularly in the LGBTQ community. Health and Human Services, we talk about health advocacy, our whole prior talk, the Department of Justice. None of these entities require collecting data around sexual orientation or gender identity. And that is preventing us from creating knowledge that will then help us in the future to meet the needs of our community. This makes it challenging to support policies and point to data and say, these are places that people need help because we don't have the data necessarily to speak to. Instead, a lot of that research has fallen on individual researchers instead of these federal entities that we would hope provide us helpful information through, say, oh, I don't know, the census or something like that. Instead, I will talk a little bit about some data that we have from individual researchers, published in either academic peer-reviewed journals or data from nonprofit organizations. The research, to me, when I read it, aligns a lot with my lived experience. So maybe my lived experiences is not so not useful. It's helpful in the way that I did find a lot of support for these same challenges that others face. The idea of college choice is a burden that students report. LGBTQ students trying to navigate and finding a space that will be open and inclusive for them. There are issues around financial access. If you know anything about the FAFSA, if you have had to do that or advise students, it is an extreme challenge, and LGBTQ students often lack familial support, and that presents issues because you need familial support to file a FAFSA and get financial aid for college. These students often report feeling a lack of belonging in their institutions and report lower levels of mentorship, which is important for our academic and career success. What we know is really helpful is to have support for LGBTQ students and to increase their involvement within our campus community and the community beyond, and being civically engaged. If we thought there was little experience on students, there's probably even less on faculty. And I don't even say staff here because I don't have data to speak to that. I focus specifically on faculty because there are some groups like AFT that collect data on faculty experiences. Being a faculty member is a very privileged position. And despite this, we still see about 35% of LGBTQ faculty being fearful of disclosing their identities at work. Many faculty report experiencing harassment because of their identity, or an overwhelming 60% reporting of all faculty members, not just queer faculty members, reporting that they have witnessed instances of LGBTQ plus harassment on their own campuses. So this is a prevalent issue that we're facing. This idea of identity disclosure comes with risks. Research tells us that it also comes with some potential rewards and that we can connect with others on our campus, which also again resonates with my experience. Being out and disclosing my identity on campus allowed me to find community in some ways that helped me to thrive in even a challenging environment. It also, however, brings responsibilities. Being tokenized as one of 2 LGBTQ faculty members on our entire campus of, over 3,000 students certainly leads to an additional burden of being the person that is called in to do DEI work, the person who is called in to educate others, and the person who, as much as I love to advise and support my students, it becomes also a little bit in a way of a burden because I can't share that with other people. And it brings just an additional taxing workload without having more representation in our university. There's also data showing that bias towards LGBTQ people impacts our career trajectories, anywhere from biased student evaluations towards queer faculty members. LGBTQ people are less likely to receive grant funding through like the NIH. And there's even case study evidence that there have been tenure and promotion decisions that have been impacted by people's sexual or gender identity. So these things matter. And we need to start to fight back against this stereotype of the liberal indoctrinating university. Because while that may be true in some cases, that some universities are these beautiful liberal havens for people, that stereotype has been perpetuated largely from certain types of institutions, like some large public institutions or from public Ivies, through institutions that are not your everyday average university or college. It is most certainly not the institution in which I have inhabited. Rural universities and rural conservative places like Wingate University, places in which politics have greatly infiltrated the running and management of even what can be taught in our classes. Florida is a current example of how this is continuing, where these policies around Don't Say Gay started in saying these were only for elementary schools, they're only for K through 12, and now it's an attempt to infiltrate what can be taught in universities and colleges. This also doesn't take into account faith-based universities. So while my university now doesn't claim to be a faith-based university, instead we say that we support students exploring their faith, whatever it is. We certainly have a faith-based history, and other institutions like Liberty right down the road from us in North Carolina is extremely a faith-based institution, which has explicit policies that their students or their faculty members cannot be gay. And those institutions certainly do not represent this liberal university that we hear about. And then we have to think more about broader communities. Even if we do attend one of those wonderful liberal institutions, if you're lucky enough to go to one, in my own, again, experience in working, being thankful to have worked at the University of Virginia, which I did find to be an extremely welcoming place. Even there were Nazis protesting in Charlottesville when I worked there, right? Who ran over and killed a protester while I worked there. So our broader communities impact our day-to-day lives and our ability to function. This area is really less well known because it's so niche, right? Like, how do students or employees at higher education institutions exist within a broader conservative environment? And so there's just really not a whole lot of information about that specific question quite yet, although I hope that maybe someday I can contribute to that. But we do have some research broadly about how LGBTQ people survive and live and what their well-being looks like in conservative areas. In areas in which the political climate is really anti-LGBTQ, we know that LGBTQ youth have increased risks of self-harm and suicide. in areas just in which they are more politically conservative, this comes across in the behaviors of the community members. And so LGBTQ youth report being bullied more in these conservative areas. And when we track over time the ebb and flow of political leanings, increases in conservatism are linked to nationwide increases in depression in LGBTQ people. So this, really clearly then suggests that if you live your day-to-day life in a very conservative area with anti-LGBT policies and people protesting your existence down the street, it's probably going to have an impact on your mental health and your ability to function. It also impacts practical things about your life, not just well-being and mental health, but how do you literally go about and live your life? Can you go get a marriage certificate at your town hall? Can you go out to eat with your significant other? Can you send your child to school without fear of them being bullied or harassed? Are just everyday decisions. Do you send your child to a particular daycare? As also a new parent with a 10-month-old baby, these are questions that my wife and I started to navigate, and living in the space that we did and suddenly having a fear of what do I do in this situation, and things that other people would never have to really think about. But living in that community and in that space, it became a very tangible fear of what happens if I do this in the place that I live, because of this broader community. Even though I feel safe going to my job at my university, this broader community has an impact on us. And that's something that I think we really need to start to think a bit more about. I don't think that anybody in here needs a lesson on your town, but I will tell you my perspective. When we first talked about this, I, I wanted to give you what it looked like as an outsider. So almost like pretend that I was applying for a job at your institution at MTSU. And the research that I would have done, like I had to do when I was on the market, to research the place in which I was applying, the university, their policies. I told my institution, this is what I did. This is what I had to do before I applied to somewhere to work. And I would start by researching them, Googling them, looking on their website. What was the information I could find about the queer community or their support? And these are some of the things that I found when I looked up your town, which are probably not unfamiliar. Archaic, the Tennessee town that made homosexuality illegal. Murfreesboro sued over ordinance in the Borough Pride Festival, permit denial. Rutherford County's library system bans 4 books with LGBTQ plus themes after this decency ordinance. Eventually, some of these news stories talking about how the fallout from this, and so the city abandoning its ban on being gay in public. Murfreesboro being fined $500,000 in its settlement over its anti-LGBTQ ordinance. Yeah. And now finally, it's legal to be publicly gay in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Yay. So as an outsider, right, to me, this is, again, it's just very familiar to the place in which I lived. I saw such parallels and such similarity. We have not yet had a law passed in Monroe, North Carolina, that it is illegal to be gay, but I'm sure they're working on it. They're our new mayor. I'm sure he's like really thinking about how we can do this and not get sued for $500,000. So it was not unfamiliar, but again, as an outsider, this would be something that I would see and I would consider as like, is this a place in which I would want to live and exist? The strange unparallel for me and my job search and working at Wingate is that I was the person that helped to bring pride. So when you Google searched our area before I worked there, you wouldn't have seen anything like this, because all of us queers were just like quietly existing in this space, and like everybody was just getting along because they were tolerating us in silence. If you can't tell, I'm not a quiet person. So now you would see many of these headlines when you Google search Monroe, North Carolina. I also looked at your institution. So looking at MTSU, and actually I found a lot of positive things. And I, as somebody who studies social comparison, I cannot help but do this in a social comparison type way, and see the things that your university offers that ours does not. So this is not to say that your university doesn't have a ways to go, but I was like, computer snaps. I'm very glad that you have a lot of these things there. And my caveat there is that almost everything, well, actually, I think in fact, everything that I saw was very student focused, which is not completely unsurprising given that higher education institutions are focused on student learning and student experience and student retention and all the things that I know about. But we also want to make sure that the faculty and staff members that the university employs are also supported, not just our students. So lots of things in this lovely word cloud you probably are familiar with. This wonderful conference, your Lambda Association, efforts for community engagement, diversity scholarships, safe zone programs, maps of gender inclusive restrooms on campus, and lots of information for LGBTQ students. I even found, shout out to social work, a library libguide on LGBTQ issues. Just like some really great stuff that if you certainly search LGBT on Wingate University's website, you will not find. So some great things. But what was missing were these broader things, right? What is the university's positionality on LGBTQ issues, on broader issues? And that is a contentious point very often that I have experienced in my own journey through higher education and trying to get administration on board to make those kinds of statements. And so while all of these things were wonderful, they looked like they were very student-led and perhaps faculty-led. And I wasn't clear if that was also administrative-led or administrative supportive. And maybe being a cynical person who has worked in less than inclusive spaces and had lots of experiences with our own administration, I read between the lines. And so maybe I'm wrong there and your administration is super wonderful and supportive. And then I would suggest that they put that somewhere. But maybe they're not. And maybe that's a challenge that you're facing. Faculty and staff representation, there's not an easy way to always identify this. I don't know if your faculty and staff are representative of the LGBTQ community. There wasn't really any information that I could find there. And that is very important for students. And oftentimes we code that in like, check out these people who have done safe zone training, and like, well, but maybe that's a queer person and maybe that's not. And so like we should probably have some more information available so that students can connect with mentors, so that people applying to your institution would know that they wouldn't be tokenized, that they wouldn't be the only queer faculty member on your campus. And again, sometimes these are things that come across once we interview or attend or come to a place, but other times it's something that you would want to know before you even choose to apply, especially when in the back of your mind, you're thinking about the town that made it illegal to be gay. So we might need some more forward messaging to folks. Community engagement is discussed as a goal, but it doesn't really talk about what that looks like. And this one in particular, in the place in which you are situated, needs to be extremely clear. How do faculty, staff, students, administrators, the university as an entity engage with the community to make it a more welcoming place? I labeled this talk a welcoming island in a sea of prejudice, but really maybe it's not the right metaphor or whatever, because your university cannot exist as separate from the community in which it lives. It's impossible, right? Your university is part of that community. It is not separate. And so you have to figure out a way in which to build a stronger community outside of the walls of the university as well. So what does that look like? There are other things too I just mentioned here that are things that cannot be Googled. We can't know this about your university until we start to engage, but just things for you to know and that maybe you would have some more insight on is about internal communication. We had protesters on our campus who came and protested an LGBTQ youth event that we hosted. It was literally a game night for LGBTQ youth to attend and play board games. And we had protesters banging on the walls of our academic building that we hosted it in. And our university sent out zero communication about that incident and what had happened on our campus. Now, our administration was very supportive of the event. They provided us with additional security. They have provided us with a place. They provided us with all the things that we might need. But that silence was deafening to our students and to our faculty members, that our administrators would not make a public statement initially about what had occurred at that event. And that was harmful to us. And then when finally, after much badgering, they eventually did send out a public statement, it was very blasé, right? And it did not say what we wanted it to, which was, we firmly stand against people who hate queer people, which is shouldn't be a very difficult thing to say. So this idea of internal communication within your institution is very important to show support for the people that work and learn at your institution. Those interview experiences that I talked about, are your other faculty members and administrators able to talk to LGBTQ people when they come and interview? Are they able to talk to students when they come visit your campus? Oftentimes students interface mostly with a lot of other students when they're looking at a university, but your faculty members, potential faculty members or staff are going to interface with other faculty members and staff and admins, and they need to be able to talk and have those conversations and not say biased comments, and also be able to just talk about LGBTQ issues. Talking about representation, what does your student body look like? What do your faculty and staff look like? And also, when we talk about those ideas of tenure and promotion, do you have things in place that give folks credit for the work that they do within the sphere of LGBTQ issues, whether it's their research or their activism? Does that help them? Is that something that's going to be beneficial for their tenure and promotion as opposed to something that might be harmful? I can't ever leave a talk just by presenting you with the horrors. I have to talk about the recommended action. Every time I talk to administrators, I say, but what are you going to do, right? What is the action? I really don't care about anything else that you have to say until you tell me the action, because that's all that matters in the end. And as much as we can say this is so important and we care about it and let's have a discussion, if you don't do anything, then it didn't really matter. And this is clearly the hardest part to do, is to actually do things. For folks here, point one is probably not as important. So you are already here being educated and hopefully getting informed. But to make sure that folks on your campus are educated and informed, even allies. Thinking about this at a very microcosm level of what about your department? Think about, I tell people, your sphere of influence. You certainly can't, as one person, go and change the world or maybe your town, but you have smaller spaces in which you can do action and make a difference. So is it the office that you work in, your department? Is it your college? Is it an organization you're a part of? Is it a committee that you were on? And think about those very small spheres of influence and how can you educate and inform people. Proactively checking in on your colleagues and students. This one seems like it doesn't really mean much, but again, in those days where I was going through the trauma of being targeted and bullied, not one of my colleagues ever asked me if I was okay. And that also felt really harmful. It felt emotionally exhausting for me to recognize that while I was going through a traumatic experience, those people were eating lunch and teaching their class and having their regular day-to-day lives without having to deal with what I was dealing with and without being concerned about it. And so if even one person had said to me, I know that you're dealing with some stuff right now. How are you doing? Are you okay? That would have been so meaningful to me in that moment. So proactively, don't wait for having to see the fallout of something, but check in beforehand, because you never know what your LGBTQ students or faculty or staff members are dealing with on that day in the world in which we live. If you're in some type of privileged position, which many of us are, use that to speak out and make LGBTQ issues a priority. Again, what committee are you on? What student organization do you work with? What policy could you potentially bring? We're still plugging away all these years later, trying to get like some gender inclusive restrooms or a campus map like you all have. And we just do that. We keep using the privilege that we have to work towards those goals. So figure out the ways in which you can do that. If you witness prejudice, speak up. This seems like a pretty straightforward one, but it's actually very hard to do when you're in an awkward situation. And so the recommendation is to practice what you would say beforehand, because in the moment, it's hard to know the words that you say when you witness bias, but instead practice them so you know exactly what you will say when somebody says or does something homophobic or transphobic in front of you. As a pro tip, oftentimes just ask them, what do you mean by that? And that will usually make them shut up real quick and reflect on what they just said. Um, Volunteer to do service that often falls on LGBTQ people. Again, being tokenized as a smaller group where it always falls on you to do certain types of tasks or service work, stepping in to volunteer for those things or take some burden off is really helpful. If you're in a position to help to support hiring more LGBTQ faculty and staff. When it comes to faculty decisions, oftentimes that means putting a position that might be relevant to LGBTQ issues and trying to have a targeted hire. It might be advertising your positions in different places. It might be targeting LGBTQ scholars and asking them individually to apply for your faculty position. And help to support those people once they get to your institution. And this is one of the hardest things to do, but we find this again and again, and this is what I have told in face-to-face conversations with our own president of our university, is that if you bring people from minoritized backgrounds to your campus, you are now even more responsible for supporting them. To bring them to your campus, to tokenize them as your diversity and put their picture on your website or on a brochure, and then not support them while they are here is actively harming those students and faculty and staff members. And that is too often what we do. This means that we also have to create public shows of support, and this is very important again when it comes to administration. Just supporting silently or behind closed doors does not help to change culture. And this leads to passive support that doesn't show in any other public way. The example of, for example, our university would support students if they wanted to table at Union County Pride, and they could get RSO funds to do that. But our university wouldn't endorse Union County Pride, right? They would not table as an institution. That is quiet, silent, passive support where the burden is placed on students and they are not making an open statement about it. In our actual communities, I think that this is the hardest one. And when we think about what we can do within the university, that seems more attainable. But don't forget or don't question your ability to also change the broader community. While we certainly still face plenty of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in Monroe, North Carolina, there is change coming and happening. And it is because of the queer people that live there and that we have refused to be silent. And we have continued to work. And we have had Pride for 2 years, and it will keep coming. And we will still have drag events. And we will live there because I pay taxes there too. And I will not be silent in that community. And that is the only way in which it changes. So don't question that you can be influential in that community. Be educated about local politics, like your local mayoral election, which had 3% of our population participate in and ended in a tie and a coin flip. Support LGBTQ businesses that are allies of the LGBTQ community. I never failed to go and eat and support at our business, East Franks, that flies our flag in downtown Monroe and faces harassment and lawsuits because they do these things. Support your local nonprofits. We have not very many in our area, more towards Charlotte, but we try to do that as well, whether that's with your volunteerism or with your money if you have it. Use your privilege in other community organizations. For example, I sit on the board for our local community shelter. And why do you think I wanted to be on the board of our local community shelter? So that I could teach them about how to help our unhoused LGBTQ people in our community. And so bringing that as a concern to that organization and institution that doesn't have the knowledge or education to be prepared to work on that issue. So find your niche and bring those concerns to the table. Is it a healthcare facility? Is it your church, right? Like think about the places in which you exist and have influence. Especially within our school systems. We see the continued attack, whether it's on K through 12 or higher education, on the people that are at greatest vulnerability, LGBTQ youth, who are so vulnerable in these situations in the face of hate. So to be involved in that school system and support them. Live your allyship in your personal relationships. When you see things, don't be quiet about it, and attend or support protests in some way. These are just some recommendations. Just get going on this very short list of things that I'm sure we're all ready to get done tomorrow, right? I will make a shameless plug for myself. If you want to learn more about my experience and other faculty members who worked at my institution and places, other places across the country, I worked on this great book called The Changing Faces of Higher Education, from Boomers to Millennials. We wanted to name the book OK Boomer, but our publisher said no, that wouldn't sell. So The Changing Faces of Higher Education. And our chapter in there particularly is Wear Long Sleeves and Say Bless You, working as other and conservative academia. I mean, there's lots of other great folks that have written chapters in that book, but we really focus on this idea of being an LGBTQ person in a Southern conservative rural institution, and a lot of my other colleagues who wrote about that as well. And as has been mentioned, you can read a little brief article from Psychonomics on being LGBTQ in towns and gowns. And thank you so much.
Could I have the mic for questions if anybody has any questions? I just want to say all that to that last part of that. Thank you.
So I just wanted to say, as someone who is still pretty young and in college, it is definitely very hard trying to have a voice for yourself. Sometimes it's very easy to feel like, oh, I don't have influence. I can't control what's happening with my education. I can't control what's happening with my life. So I think like being able to see what you said was very inspirational, because it kind of like gave it back a little bit, like, oh, there are things we can do and there are things that can be done in our community, but it is very hard, and people, it's like hard to push back against it because they're pushing back twice as much as you're pushing back, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I'm glad that anybody has ever found anything that I said inspirational. So thank you. You've just made my day. No, I totally understand. I will say in some ways, I still feel that way, right? Like, I don't know, when I get an email that somebody read this article, it's like, wow, anything that I did mattered, like somebody cares. But so it can feel like that. And it does, it feels really exhausting. And as much as I try to have that positive, like, we got to get out there and do things and make change, there are other times where I'm like crying in my bathroom, like, should we move somewhere else? Like, should I just give up on this? And it's like, no, at the end of the day, I know when I look backwards, right, and we see progress, that the only way that it happens is from many people taking small steps to make that change. I will give you an example from, this is very much the sentiment that my students felt. I taught a special topics class, we call it We Engage, where we teach a semester-long class, and then we take a trip somewhere and do service work related to the topic of our class. And so I taught a class on LGBTQ youth's experience of homelessness. And we took a trip to New York City, and we interfaced with lots of different organizations that help LGBTQ youth in general and around the issue of homelessness. And I brought 13 undergraduate students to New York City when I was 7 months pregnant, by the way. So, and walked them around the city and did service. And we came to this one point where we had this conversation, and my student was like, I am like just utterly depressed by this trip. Like, look at all the things that New York City has. Like, look at all of these services and support, and everybody's so welcoming and like wonderful and like, woo, go gay people. Like, that was like sort of what they took away from it. And I was like, but did you listen to the person that talked and said, 20, 30, 40 years ago, do you think that it was like this? When we went on that gay history tour, that was not how it was. When we talked about protests that happened, that's not how it always was. And I think it's so hard for students or people in general, not just students, but especially when you're young and new to these things, to think about what could I possibly do? But remember that everything that has been done was just by regular people. They weren't superheroes, right? They were anybody just like you. And it takes time, and it takes unrelenting persistence, that you just don't give up in the face of that. Like every time I think about, wouldn't it just be easier if I went and worked over here or had this lived in this place, but then this place would never change. And that's also just a disclaimer, not to say that like it's not okay to do that. Like for some people, their literal physical life and safety is like in jeopardy and they need to go and live or be somewhere else. And that's perfectly fine. But for me, as somebody who's extremely stubborn, yeah, you just keep doing it every day and know that like you might not see it today or tomorrow, but eventually you will be the people that we talk about at this conference, right? Like that is how it happens. So don't give up.
Thank you for coming today. So my question to you is, I'm back here.
Oh,
Sorry.
I hear a voice, but I don't see you. Hi.
So can you talk a little bit about how you navigate showing support for students in those conversations you have with students or your colleagues when you're in an atmosphere where the institution as a whole may not be doing things the way that you would like for them to do it, and just kind of talking about how you talk through that with students and colleagues, but also on the flip side of that, how do you yourself kind of handle, if you experience this, compassion fatigue and having to constantly be the person having those conversations?
Yes, absolutely. I will, to your second question, yes, absolutely. I feel compassion fatigue all the time. For students, I think it's, I think about some specific examples of students that I had. I mentioned having experienced classrooms that presented biased content, particularly transphobic content. And really for me, when that student came to me and said, this is what our teacher like is teaching in class. And I was like, oh my God, okay, we got to do something about this. I'm an action person. So the way in which I approach that most of the time, I feel like, is to take advantage of the systems and processes in the institution that I know about that students might not. So I'm like, we're going to community standards. Let's go over here. Let's fill out this report. Like, let me take you to the website. Let me fill out this bias incident report over here. Let me set up a meeting with our provost so I can have a personal conversation with him about how this is super inappropriate. So I try to use the privileges that I have as a faculty member and the knowledge that I have, and to try to approach it from a place of like how I actually talk to them, which I think is part of your question, is obviously a place of concern, but to the same point of like, I will not let this stand as something that is okay. And I can't always control the outcome. So in fact, in that actual situation, the outcome was not what I hoped it was. There was some action, but it wasn't what I hoped would be action. But I was there to tell that student, like, I will not let this go and just say, oh, well, you just got to deal with it. And I think that that oftentimes is just so much what students need in that moment, is somebody to advocate for them. It doesn't certainly lead to what you're asking about in your second part of your question, which is some level of like exhaustion, right? Because like anytime something like this happens, there are only 3 of us. So like they're going to come talk to us about it. And we're also at the same time advocating for ourselves in other situations. So I'm not really sure that I have a good answer of how to manage that. We do the best that we can in our situation. And trying to share those responsibilities. But I hope that part of that comes from that we continue pushing for policies in which we hire more diverse faculty and staff members, that we can share that burden with other people, share that fatigue with others, as kind as that sounds for our colleagues. And just try to have more support. I think that that's really what you have to have in the end, and more institutional supports, which we don't have. Knowledge is one of the biggest like lack of resources when it comes to these types of issues on a campus like mine. So you can't go to other people because they don't know anything. So they're not going to be helpful in those cases. So we need to hire more people that have that knowledge, and using that argument to show that we need people that are knowledgeable about these topics in hiring. Yeah, hope that answers.